Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she adjusted the heavy research equipment strapped to her back. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the archaeological team as they made their way through the rocky terrain of the Wakhan corridor. At 28, she was the youngest member of the international expedition, but her expertise in ancient trade routes had earned her a place among the seasoned researchers. "The GPS shows we're still 3 kilometers from the target site," called Dr. Richardson, the British team leader, his voice carrying across the barren landscape. The team had been walking for 4 hours since leaving their base camp, following what they believed to be remnants of an ancient Silk Road trading post. Maria checked her water supply, half empty already, and they hadn't even reached their destination. The local guides had warned them about the harsh conditions, but nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming isolation of this place. Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks sharp against the cloudless sky. The expedition consisted of 8 members from various universities, along with 3 local Afghan guides and 2 security personnel provided by the government. They had spent weeks obtaining permissions and coordinating with local authorities to access this remote region near the Pakistani and Chinese borders. The area was known for its archaeological significance, but also for its dangers: harsh weather, difficult terrain, and occasional reports of militant activity. As they continued their trek, Maria noticed one of the security guards, Ahmad, speaking urgently into his radio. His expressions grew increasingly tense with each exchange. Dr. Richardson noticed too and approached him with concern. "Everything all right?" Richardson asked through their interpreter. Ahmad's response was rapid and agitated. The interpreter, a local man named Farid, turned pale as he translated. "He says there are reports of armed groups in the area. The government forces that were supposed to provide our safe passage have been reassigned to another emergency." The team gathered around as the gravity of the situation became clear. They were deep in hostile territory with minimal protection, and their planned route back to the nearest town was no longer secure. Dr. Richardson tried to maintain calm, but Maria could see the worry in his eyes. "We should turn back immediately," said Dr. Peterson, the German geologist. "The research isn't worth risking our lives." But Ahmad shook his head vigorously when this was translated. He explained that their return route was now considered compromised. Reports indicated that the same militants who had caused the government troops to be redirected were moving through the valleys they had used to reach this location. The team set up an impromptu meeting, spreading their maps on a flat rock. The situation was becoming clearer and more frightening by the minute. They were essentially trapped, unable to go forward safely to their research site, and unable to return via their planned route. The radio communications with their base support team had been intermittent all morning and now seemed to have cut out entirely. Maria studied the topographical maps, her training in geographical navigation proving valuable. There were alternative routes marked, old mountain passes used by traders centuries ago, but they were unmarked trails that would require local knowledge to navigate safely. "What about these mountain paths?" she asked Farid, pointing to the faint lines on the map. "Could we use these to reach a safe area?" Farid consulted with the guides in rapid Dari. Their discussion was animated, with frequent gestures toward the surrounding mountains. Finally, he turned back to the group with a mixture of hope and uncertainty in his voice. "They say yes, these old paths can be used, but they are very dangerous. The trails are not maintained, and the weather can change quickly in the mountains. It would take at least 3 days of hard walking, and we would need to travel light." Dr. Richardson made the decision that would change everything. "We'll attempt the mountain route. Everyone pack only essential supplies: water, food for 3 days, basic shelter, and emergency equipment. Leave all non-essential research materials here." As the team prepared for their unexpected detour, Maria felt a chill despite the heat. Something about the way the guides kept looking at each other made her uneasy. Their body language suggested they knew more than they were sharing. She approached Farid privately. "Is there something else we should know about these mountain paths?" she asked quietly. Farid glanced around nervously before responding. "These trails, they cross through areas controlled by different groups. Not all of them are friendly to foreigners, and the weather in the high passes can kill even experienced mountaineers." Maria felt her stomach tighten. They were choosing between certain danger behind them and potential death ahead, but at least ahead offered a chance, however slim. The team began their ascent into the mountains late that afternoon. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than scattered stones and occasional scratch marks on rocky surfaces. Within the first hour, the temperature began to drop noticeably as they gained altitude. Maria found herself walking near the back of the group, partially by choice and partially because her shorter legs meant she couldn't keep pace with the longer strides of her colleagues. The terrain became increasingly treacherous, with loose rocks that shifted underfoot and narrow ledges that hugged cliff faces. As evening approached, the guides called for a halt. They had reached a small plateau that offered some shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and Maria could see her breath in the thin air. "We'll camp here tonight," Dr. Richardson announced. "Everyone stay close together. We'll resume at first light." Maria helped set up the small tents, but her attention kept drifting to the guides. They were having another intense discussion, and their body language was increasingly agitated. Ahmad, the security guard, joined their conversation, and his expressions grew more alarmed with each exchange. During the evening meal of dried rations and tea brewed over a small camping stove, Farid approached Dr. Richardson with obvious reluctance. "The guides are saying the weather forecast is very bad. A storm is coming tomorrow night, maybe sooner. They want to know if we should turn back now while we still can." Dr. Richardson looked at the clear stars overhead. "It doesn't look like storm weather to me." "In the mountains, weather changes very quickly," Farid explained, "and at this altitude, a storm could be deadly." The team debated their options late into the night: turn back and face the militants, or continue forward and risk being caught in a mountain storm. Maria contributed her knowledge of mountain weather patterns, but she had never experienced conditions like these. Finally, Dr. Richardson made the decision. "We continue tomorrow. We're already committed to this route, and we can't waste the distance we've covered today." Maria settled into her sleeping bag, but sleep eluded her. The thin air made breathing difficult, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the mountains. She could hear the guides talking in low voices outside the tents, their conversation continuing long into the night. She woke before dawn to find frost covering her sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped below freezing during the night, and her water bottle was partially frozen. As she emerged from her tent, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The guides were gone. Their packs, their supplies, even their tent. Everything had vanished during the night. Only the international team members and Ahmad remained, looking around in bewilderment at the abandoned camp. "They've left us," Dr. Richardson said quietly, his voice barely concealing his shock. "They've taken half our supplies and abandoned us in the mountains." Ahmad was frantically trying his radio, but got only static. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. They were alone in one of the most remote and dangerous regions on Earth, with limited supplies and no knowledge of the local terrain. Maria felt a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She pulled out her map and studied their position. According to her calculations, they were at least 40 kilometers from any marked settlement, in terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers. "Why would they leave us?" asked Dr. Peterson, his voice shaking slightly. Farid, who had remained behind, looked ashamed as he explained. "They said the storm coming is worse than they first thought. They said foreigners would slow them down too much, and they cannot risk their own lives." The abandonment was devastating. But what made it worse was the discovery of just how much the guides had taken. Nearly half their food supplies were gone, along with most of the cold weather gear and emergency equipment. They had been left with enough to survive perhaps 2 days in good weather, but not the 3 or 4 days it would take to reach safety. Ahmad tried to take charge, but he was a security guard from Kabul, not a mountain guide. His knowledge of this terrain was limited to the basic briefings he had received before the mission. The responsibility of navigation fell increasingly to Maria, whose geographical training was their best hope. She spread the maps on a flat rock and studied their options. The marked trails were incomplete, showing only approximate routes through the mountains. Without the guide's local knowledge, they would be navigating by topographical features and compass bearings alone. "There's a valley marked here," she said, pointing to the map. "If we can reach it, it should lead to a river system that flows toward populated areas, but it means crossing 2 mountain passes, and the altitude will be challenging." The team looked at the daunting route she had traced. Even Dr. Richardson, who had maintained optimism throughout the crisis, looked uncertain. "How long would that take?" he asked. "Without guides and carrying our own packs, probably 4 days minimum. Maybe more if the weather turns bad." They spent the morning redistributing the remaining supplies and making hard decisions about what to carry and what to leave behind. Maria's research materials, months of work, were abandoned to save weight for food and water. Every team member was limited to 1 small pack with the absolute essentials. As they prepared to leave the plateau, Maria took one last look at their abandoned equipment. Among the items left behind were the satellite phones that might have been their salvation if they could have reached higher ground with better signal reception. But carrying them would mean leaving behind water or food, and the choice was obvious. The descent from the plateau began well, with clear weather and a reasonable trail. But within hours, clouds began building around the peaks, and the wind picked up significantly. The guide's warning about incoming weather appeared to be accurate. By midday, the first snow flurries began to fall. Maria checked her altimeter. They were still ascending, which meant the conditions would only get worse. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow, with snow covering the already faint markings that indicated the route. Dr. Richardson called for frequent rest stops, but Maria could see that several team members were already struggling with the altitude and physical demands. Dr. Peterson was breathing heavily, and Dr. Liu, the Chinese archaeologist, was showing signs of altitude sickness. As the afternoon wore on, the snow increased to a steady fall, and visibility began to drop. Maria realized they needed to find shelter soon, or they would be caught in potentially deadly conditions on an exposed mountain face. She studied the map and the surrounding terrain. There should be a rock formation ahead that might offer some protection, but in the increasing snow, it was becoming difficult to navigate by landmarks. "We need to stop and set up emergency shelter," she called to Dr. Richardson. "This storm is getting worse." But when she looked around, she realized with horror that in the blowing snow and difficult terrain, the group had spread out more than they intended. She could see Dr. Richardson and Ahmad ahead, but the rest of the team was strung out behind, some already barely visible in the increasingly heavy snowfall. She turned to call back to the others, but her voice was lost in the wind. The storm that the guides had warned about was arriving with frightening speed, and their small group of inexperienced mountain travelers was about to face conditions that killed experienced climbers. Maria made a decision that would save her life and doom the others. Instead of trying to gather the scattered team in the worsening storm, she pushed forward alone toward the rock formation she had spotted on the map. Her reasoning was logical: find shelter, then signal for the others to join her. But the mountain had other plans. Within 30 minutes, the snowstorm had become a complete whiteout, and Maria found herself alone in hostile wilderness, cut off from her companions and facing a night that would test every survival skill she had ever learned. The last thing she heard before the wind swallowed all other sounds was someone calling her name from somewhere behind her in the storm. But by then, she could see nothing beyond a few feet in any direction, and any attempt to return would have meant certain death in the blizzard that was now raging around her. She was alone, abandoned first by their guides and now separated from her team, in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The title of her story had become her reality. She had been left to perish in hostile lands, and her survival would depend entirely on her own resourcefulness and determination. Maria pressed herself against the cold rock face as the blizzard raged around her. Snow stung her exposed skin, and the wind threatened to tear her small pack from her shoulders. She had found a narrow crevice between two large boulders, barely wide enough for her body, but it offered some protection from the worst of the storm. Her hands were already numb despite her gloves, and she knew she had perhaps an hour before hypothermia became a serious threat. The emergency shelter in her pack was designed for 2 people, a lightweight tarp that could be stretched between rocks or trees. Working by feel in the darkness, she managed to create a crude lean-to that blocked most of the wind and snow. Inside her makeshift shelter, Maria took inventory of her supplies. 1 water bottle, half frozen, 3 energy bars, a handful of dried fruit, and a small bag of nuts. A basic first aid kit. A sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to -10 Celsius, but the mountain temperatures were dropping far below that. Her clothing was designed for day hiking in moderate conditions, not surviving a blizzard at high altitude. She forced herself to eat one of the energy bars, knowing her body needed fuel to generate heat. The chocolate was frozen solid, and she had to warm pieces in her mouth before she could chew them. Every movement was calculated to conserve energy and body heat. The storm raged through the night, and Maria dozed fitfully, waking frequently to check that her shelter was holding. Each time she woke, the cold had penetrated deeper into her bones. By dawn, she was shivering uncontrollably despite being inside her sleeping bag. When the wind finally began to subside, Maria emerged from her shelter to face a transformed landscape. Snow covered everything in pristine white, but it also concealed the trail markers and landmarks she needed for navigation. Worse, the storm had been accompanied by a temperature drop that turned her remaining water into solid ice. She spent the first hour of daylight trying to get her bearings. The storm had disoriented her completely. She couldn't even determine which direction she had come from. Mountain peaks surrounded her on all sides, their snow-covered faces reflecting brilliant sunlight that hurt her eyes. Without sunglasses, which had been lost during the night, she would soon face snow blindness if she wasn't careful. Maria pulled out her compass and map, spreading them on a flat rock. The compass needle pointed steadily north, but the mountain terrain around her didn't match what she remembered from the previous day. Either she had traveled farther than she thought while searching for shelter, or the storm had completely confused her sense of direction. She studied the topographical lines on her map, trying to match them with the ridges and valleys visible around her. Gradually, she began to piece together her approximate location. She was in a small valley between 2 major peaks, probably several kilometers south of where she had intended to be. The realization of her situation hit her with full force. She was alone in the Afghan mountains, with less than 2 days' food and water, wearing inadequate clothing, and with no communication equipment. Even if rescue teams were searching for her, finding one person in this vast wilderness would be nearly impossible. But Maria had not survived 4 years of graduate geological fieldwork by giving up when conditions became difficult. She had navigated through dangerous terrain in South America, survived equipment failures in the Australian outback, and dealt with hostile weather in Alaska. This situation was more extreme than anything she had faced, but the basic principles of wilderness survival remained the same. First priority was water. She gathered clean snow in her empty water bottle and placed it inside her jacket, using body heat to melt it slowly. It was an inefficient process, but it would prevent dehydration. She also identified several rocky areas where afternoon sunshine might create temporary water from melting snow. Second priority was determining the correct direction to travel. Based on her map study, she needed to reach the valley floor and follow it downstream. Mountain streams eventually led to rivers. Rivers led to communities, and communities meant rescue. Third priority was rationing her food to last as long as possible while maintaining enough energy for traveling. She divided her remaining supplies into portions that would provide minimal calories for 5 days, hoping that would be enough time to reach help. Maria began her descent toward the valley floor, moving slowly to conserve energy and avoid injury. The fresh snow made footing treacherous, and a twisted ankle or broken leg would mean certain death. She used her adjustable hiking poles as probes, testing each step before committing her weight. The descent took most of the morning. Several times she had to backtrack when apparent paths led to dead ends or dangerous cliff faces. Without the guide's knowledge of safe routes, she was forced to find her own way through terrain that had challenged travelers for centuries. By midday, she reached what appeared to be a stream bed, though it was now frozen and covered with snow. This was encouraging. It meant she had found the drainage system that would eventually lead to lower elevations and hopefully inhabited areas. Following the stream bed proved easier than navigating the mountain slopes, but it presented new challenges. The valley was narrow and winding, with steep sides that blocked much of the sunlight. The temperature remained well below freezing, and Maria found herself walking through snow that was sometimes knee-deep. Her progress was painfully slow. What should have been a few hours of hiking became an entire day of struggling through difficult terrain. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she realized she would need to find shelter for another night in the open. This time she was better prepared. She had noticed a stand of scrubby trees growing in a protected area near the stream, and she made her way toward them as darkness approached. The trees were small and twisted by the harsh mountain conditions, but they provided windbreak and anchor points for her tarp. Maria spent considerable time constructing a more sophisticated shelter than the previous night's emergency arrangement. She dug a shallow pit in the snow, lined it with pine boughs, and stretched her tarp overhead in a configuration that would shed snow and block wind. It was exhausting work at altitude, but the result was a space where she could survive the night without immediate danger of freezing. Her food situation was becoming critical. She had eaten only one energy bar since the previous day, and her body was beginning to show signs of malnutrition and dehydration. The melted snow provided water, but it lacked the minerals and electrolytes her body needed for the physical demands of mountain travel. During her second night alone, Maria began to hear sounds that concerned her, the distant calls of what might be wolves or other predators. She had no weapons except her hiking poles and a small knife from her emergency kit. The sounds seemed to circle her camp, never coming close enough to be clearly identified, but close enough to keep her awake and alert. She also began to notice the effects of altitude and stress on her thinking. Simple decisions became difficult, and she found herself having to concentrate hard on tasks that should have been automatic. This was dangerous. Mountain survival required clear thinking and good judgment, and she couldn't afford to make mistakes. The third morning brought clearer weather, but also a troubling discovery. Her streambed trail had led to a junction where several valleys met, creating a confusing network of possible routes. Her map showed this area only in general terms, without the detail needed to choose the correct path. Maria spent an hour studying the terrain and considering her options. Two of the valleys led upward into higher mountains, clearly wrong directions that would take her farther from help. The third valley continued downward and showed signs of being a major drainage route. This seemed like the logical choice, but she couldn't be certain without better maps or local knowledge. She chose the downward route, knowing that any mistake would cost her precious energy and time she couldn't afford to lose. The valley was wider than the one she had been following, with evidence of seasonal water flow that suggested it carried significant drainage during warmer months. As she walked, Maria began to notice changes in the landscape that gave her hope. The vegetation was gradually becoming more diverse, with larger trees and signs of wildlife activity. These were indications that she was descending to more hospitable elevations where survival would be more achievable. But the physical demands of 3 days in extreme conditions were taking their toll. Her legs felt weak, and she had to rest frequently to avoid exhaustion. The limited food meant her body was beginning to consume its own muscle and fat reserves, leaving her increasingly frail. During one rest stop, she discovered something that provided both hope and concern: fresh tracks in the snow that appeared to be human footprints. They were recent, probably within the last day, and they followed the same valley she was traveling. This meant other people used this route, but it also raised questions about who they might be and whether encountering them would be safe. Maria decided to follow the tracks while remaining alert for any signs of danger. The footprints showed she was gaining on whoever had made them. The stride length suggested they were moving slowly, possibly carrying heavy loads or dealing with their own difficulties. By late afternoon, she crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from what appeared to be a small settlement in the valley below. It was the first sign of human habitation she had seen since being separated from her team, and it represented her best chance of survival. But approaching unknown people in this remote region required careful consideration. These could be friendly villagers who would offer help, or they could be members of the same militant groups that had caused her expedition to flee through the mountains in the first place. Maria studied the settlement from her elevated position. She could see several small buildings, probably stone construction typical of mountain communities. There were signs of agriculture, terraced fields that would be productive in warmer months. Smoke from cooking fires suggested the community was occupied and active. She also noticed that the tracks she had been following led directly toward the settlement, which meant the people who had passed this way recently were probably residents returning home. This was encouraging, as it suggested normal community activity rather than military movement. As darkness approached, Maria faced a critical decision. She could attempt to approach the settlement and seek help, risking encounter with potentially hostile people, or she could bypass the community and continue down the valley, hoping to find help elsewhere while her strength continued to deteriorate. Her physical condition made the choice clear. She was entering her 4th day with minimal food and was showing signs of severe exhaustion and altitude effects. She might not survive another night in the open, and she certainly couldn't travel much farther without assistance. Maria spent the final hours of daylight observing the settlement and planning her approach. She decided to wait until morning and then approach openly during daylight hours when her intentions would be clear. She would present herself as a lost researcher in need of help, hoping that mountain traditions of hospitality would overcome any suspicions about foreigners. She found shelter in a rock outcropping above the village, close enough to reach quickly but concealed enough to avoid detection. From this position, she could observe the community and assess the situation before making contact. As she settled into what might be her final night alone in the mountains, Maria reflected on the series of decisions and circumstances that had led her to this point. The guides who had abandoned her expedition, the storm that had separated her from her team, the navigation choices that had brought her to this valley. Each event had narrowed her options until survival depended on the kindness of strangers in one of the most remote places on Earth. She had traveled approximately 15 kilometers through some of the world's most challenging terrain, surviving conditions that would have defeated many experienced mountaineers. But tomorrow would bring the most difficult challenge yet, trusting her life to people she had never met, in a place where foreigners were often viewed with suspicion or worse. The smoke from the village fires continued to rise into the clear mountain air, a sign of warmth and human community that represented her only hope for survival. Whether that hope would be fulfilled or destroyed would be determined by decisions made by people who had no obligation to help a lost American researcher who had stumbled into their remote world. Maria woke before dawn, her body stiff from another night in freezing temperatures. The smoke from the village below still rose steadily into the crisp morning air, and she could see the first signs of daily activity. Figures moving between buildings, the sound of animals being tended. It was time to make the approach that would determine whether she lived or died. She spent precious minutes grooming herself as best she could with limited resources. First impressions would be crucial, and appearing as a threat or as someone completely destitute might determine how she was received. She wanted to look like a lost traveler in need of help, not a desperate person who might be dangerous. Maria checked her small pack one final time. She had one energy bar remaining, her water bottle, the basic first aid kit, and her maps. She also had her university identification card and research permits, which might help establish her legitimacy if the villagers could read them or knew someone who could. The descent to the village took 30 minutes of careful walking on terrain, made treacherous by morning ice. As she approached the outskirts of the settlement, Maria could see it more clearly. The buildings were indeed stone, traditional construction that had probably stood for generations. Gardens and small fields surrounded the homes, though they were now dormant under winter snow. She stopped at what seemed like a respectful distance and called out in English, then tried a few words in Arabic, hoping someone might understand. Her voice echoed off the mountain walls, and within moments, several people emerged from the buildings to investigate. The first person to approach was an elderly man wearing traditional Afghan clothing and a wool cap. His expression was curious rather than hostile, which Maria took as an encouraging sign. He called out in what she assumed was Dari or Pashto, languages she didn't speak. Maria raised her hands to show they were empty and approached slowly. She pointed to herself and said, "American, researcher," then gestured toward the mountains and said, "Lost, help." The communication was primitive, but the man seemed to understand the basic situation. More villagers gathered, including several women and children who watched from a distance. The elderly man, who appeared to be some kind of community leader, engaged in rapid discussion with the others. Maria caught a few words that sounded like foreign and mountains, but couldn't follow the conversation. After several minutes of discussion, the man gestured for Maria to follow him toward the largest building in the settlement. As they walked, she noticed details that gave her hope. This was clearly a farming community, with evidence of peaceful agricultural life. There were no weapons visible, no signs of military activity, just people living traditional mountain lives. Inside the stone building, Maria was seated near a fire pit where a woman was preparing bread. The warmth felt incredible after 4 days in near-freezing conditions, and the smell of food made her realize how desperately hungry she had become. The woman offered her tea, which she accepted gratefully. The elderly man, who introduced himself with a name that sounded like Hassan, attempted to communicate through gestures and simple words. Maria showed him her university ID and research permits, pointing to the official seals and photographs. She also showed him her maps, indicating where she thought they were located. This seemed to create understanding. Hassan nodded and pointed to a location on her map, confirming her general sense of where she had ended up. He then traced a route with his finger, showing paths that led to larger towns and eventually to roads where vehicles could travel. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young man who spoke some English. He had learned it, he explained haltingly, from aid workers who had visited the region years earlier. His name was Omar, and he served as translator between Maria and the community elders. Through Omar, Maria was able to explain her situation more clearly. She described the research expedition, the abandonment by their guides, the separation during the storm, and her several days of survival in the mountains. The villagers listened with expressions of growing amazement and sympathy. "They say you are very strong to survive alone in the high mountains," Omar translated. "Many experienced men have died in such conditions. They want to know about your companions." Maria explained that her team had been separated during the blizzard and that she hoped they had found safety, though she feared the worst. This information led to another lengthy discussion among the villagers. Hassan spoke at length, with Omar translating in fragments. "He says there have been searches. Government helicopters were flying 2 days ago looking for people, but the weather was too bad and they could not land or see much. He thinks your friends may have been found, but he is not certain." The news that search efforts had been underway gave Maria her first real hope since the ordeal began. If rescue teams were operating in the area, there might be ways to signal them or reach locations where they could find her. The immediate concern, however, was her physical condition. The village women, led by an older woman named Bibi Gul, took charge of caring for her. They provided warm food, rice with vegetables, and small pieces of meat. That was the first substantial meal she had eaten in days. They also gave her dry clothing that, while not fitting perfectly, was warm and clean. As Maria recovered her strength, she learned more about the community that had taken her in. The village was home to about 60 people, mostly related families who had lived in this valley for many generations. They survived through subsistence farming, raising livestock, and limited trade with other communities. The villagers faced their own challenges. Winter was their most difficult season, when outside contact was limited and they depended on stored food and supplies. Taking in an unexpected guest put additional strain on their resources, yet they showed no hesitation in offering help. Through Omar, Maria learned that the village had occasionally assisted other travelers who had become lost or stranded in the mountains. They viewed it as both a religious obligation and a practical matter. In such harsh conditions, communities survived by helping each other. After 2 days of rest and recovery, Maria was strong enough to discuss the practical matter of getting home. The villagers had been thinking about this problem and had some suggestions. Hassan explained that there was a larger town about 20 kilometers down the valley, accessible by a trail that was passable even in winter. The town had government offices and communication facilities where Maria could contact authorities and arrange for evacuation. However, the journey to this town required crossing territory that could be dangerous for a foreign woman traveling alone. The same factors that had made her original expedition flee to the mountains still applied. There were armed groups in the region who might view an American as either a valuable hostage or a threat to be eliminated. The solution proposed by the villagers was both simple and generous. Omar's uncle, who regularly made trading trips to the larger town, would take Maria with him on his next journey. She would travel disguised as a local woman, wearing traditional clothing and keeping her face covered. As long as they weren't stopped and questioned closely, she should be able to reach safety. The plan carried risks, but it was far better than attempting to reach help alone. Maria spent another day in the village, learning basic gestures and phrases that would help her maintain the disguise, and practicing walking and sitting in ways that would appear natural to observers. The women of the village worked together to outfit her completely in traditional dress, including a burqa that would conceal her foreign features. The clothing was somewhat large on her smaller frame, but this actually helped the disguise by making her appearance less distinctive. On her final morning in the village, Maria attempted to offer payment for the help she had received. She had no money with her, but she offered her remaining emergency supplies and equipment. The villagers politely refused everything except a small knife from her first aid kit, which they accepted more as a gesture of friendship than as payment. The departure was emotional despite the language barriers. These people had saved her life, asking nothing in return except that she remember their kindness. Maria promised through Omar that she would find ways to help the village in return, perhaps through development organizations or aid groups. The journey to the town began before dawn, with Maria and Omar's uncle, Mahmoud, traveling on foot through valleys she had been too exhausted to appreciate during her survival ordeal. The landscape was stunningly beautiful, with snow-covered peaks reflecting morning light and traditional terraces carved into mountainsides by centuries of patient farming. Mahmoud set a steady pace that covered ground efficiently while avoiding the most difficult terrain. He knew every trail and shortcut, demonstrating the intimate geographical knowledge that had allowed his people to thrive in this harsh environment for generations. They encountered other travelers occasionally, men on donkeys carrying goods between communities, shepherds moving small flocks to winter pastures. Each meeting required Maria to maintain her disguise, keeping her head down and allowing Mahmoud to do any necessary talking. The strategy worked perfectly. To casual observers, they appeared to be a local man traveling with a female relative, a common sight that attracted no special attention. Maria's height and build were not unusual enough to cause suspicion, and her limited movements could be attributed to modesty rather than unfamiliarity with local customs. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the town Mahmoud had described. It was much larger than his village, with several hundred residents, paved roads, and buildings made of concrete as well as stone. Most importantly, Maria could see radio antennas and power lines that indicated modern communication capabilities. Mahmoud led her directly to the local government office, a substantial building with official signs in both Dari and English. Inside, Maria was able to reveal her identity to officials who spoke English and could understand her situation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, she found herself surrounded by government officials, military personnel, and representatives from the American embassy in Kabul. Her disappearance had indeed triggered extensive search efforts, and she was the first confirmed survivor from her research expedition. The news about her teammates was mixed. 3 members of the group, including Dr. Richardson, had been found alive after spending 2 days sheltered in a mountain cave. They had been rescued by helicopter and evacuated to Kabul for medical treatment. 2 others had died from exposure during the storm, and 3 remained missing, though search efforts were continuing. Maria's survival story amazed the officials who debriefed her. A trained search and rescue coordinator commented that her successful navigation through unmapped terrain, combined with her survival of 4 days in extreme conditions, demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness and determination. The return to Kabul happened quickly, via military helicopter to a secure airfield and then transport plane to the capital. Within 24 hours of leaving the mountain village, Maria found herself in a modern hospital, receiving treatment for dehydration, malnutrition, and mild frostbite. The international media attention was intense but brief. Stories about the lost American researcher filled news cycles for several days before being replaced by other events. Maria gave interviews describing her ordeal, but she consistently emphasized the role of the village community in saving her life. True to her promise, Maria worked with aid organizations to establish programs that benefited the village that had rescued her. A small medical clinic was built with international funding, and agricultural development projects helped improve crop yields and livestock management. Omar was given scholarship opportunities that allowed him to pursue advanced education and eventually return to serve his community as a teacher and development coordinator. The physical recovery took months, but the psychological impact lasted much longer. Maria had been fundamentally changed by the experience of being abandoned in hostile territory and surviving through her own resourcefulness and the kindness of strangers. She completed her doctoral research using data from other expeditions, but her career focus shifted toward humanitarian work in remote communities. The experience of being helpless in foreign terrain had given her deep appreciation for the knowledge and resilience of people who lived in the world's most challenging environments. Years later, Maria returned to Afghanistan to visit the village that had saved her life. She found a community that had prospered through the development programs her advocacy had helped establish, and she was welcomed as family by people who had risked their own security to help a stranger. The elderly leader, Hassan, now in his 80s but still sharp, reminded her through Omar's translation of what he had told her during her original stay. The mountains test everyone who enters them, but they also teach important lessons to those who survive. You learn that strength comes not from being independent, but from accepting help when it is offered and giving help when it is needed. Maria's story became more than just a tale of survival. It became an example of how human compassion could overcome cultural differences, political conflicts, and geographical barriers. She had been left to perish in hostile lands, but through determination and the unexpected kindness of people who owed her nothing, she had not only survived, but thrived. The maps she had used during her ordeal were eventually donated to geographical societies with detailed annotations about the routes and hazards she had encountered. Her experience contributed to improved safety protocols for research expeditions in remote areas, and her advocacy helped establish emergency communication systems in several vulnerable regions. But perhaps most importantly, her story served as a reminder that survival often depends less on individual heroism than on the willingness of communities to extend help to those in desperate need. The villagers who rescued Maria had faced their own daily struggles for survival. Yet they shared what little they had with a stranger whose presence could have brought them danger. In a world often focused on conflict and division, Maria's experience demonstrated the power of basic human decency to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. She had been abandoned and left for dead, but she had found her way home through the combined efforts of her own determination and the generosity of people who proved that hospitality and compassion are truly universal human values. The hostile lands that had nearly claimed her life had also provided the path to her salvation through the hands and hearts of people who understood that in the face of nature's challenges, survival depends on cooperation rather than competition. Her miraculous return home was made possible not by individual heroism, but by the ancient wisdom that the strongest human response to adversity is to help one another survive it.